Many deadly battles have been fought, people slaughtered, churches robbed, souls destroyed, young women and virgins deflowered, respectable wives and widows dishonored. Towns, manors and buildings burned, and robberies, cruelties and ambushes committed on the highways. Justice has failed because of these things. The Christian faith has withered, and commerce has perished, and so many other wickednesses and horrid things have followed from these wars that they cannot be spoken, numbered, or written down. Jean II, King of France, 1360.
The Prince of Wales appeared in the English front line, his bright flag, the largest on the English side, behind and above him, and the French responded with a roar as they renewed their attack. But the English matched the war shout and surged forward themselves. Shield met shield with a crash, the weapons fell and thrust, and it was the English who forged ahead. The men trusted to guard the Prince of Wales were among the most experienced and savage in all the army. They had fought a score of battles, from Crécy to minor skirmishes, and they fought with cold-blooded ruthlessness. The two Frenchmen closest to the prince were felled instantly. Neither was killed. One was stunned by a mace blow and he collapsed to his knees, and the other took an axe blow to his right elbow that shattered the bone and left him weaponless. He was dragged backwards by his companions, and that rearward movement spread to the neighbouring Frenchmen. The half-stunned man tried to stand, but the prince kicked him backwards onto the ground and trod on his armoured wrist. "Finish him," he said to the man behind him, who used a steel-shod foot to push up the fallen man's visor and rammed down with a sword point. Blood sprayed on the prince. "Give me room," the prince bellowed. He stepped forward and swung the axe, feeling the impact jar up his arms as the blade chopped into a man's waist. He wrenched the axe free and thrust it forward. The haft was topped with a steel spike that dented the wounded man's breastplate, but did not pierce it. The man staggered, and the prince took another step forward and sliced the heavy weapon at the enemy's neck, where the sharp blade went through the mail aventail that he wore beneath his helmet to cover his neck and shoulders. The man staggered, and the prince kicked him backwards and swung at another enemy. He was fighting without a visor, and he could plainly see Charles, the Dauphin, not 10 paces away. "Come and fight me!" he bellowed in French. "You and me, Charles, come and fight!" The Dauphin, so thin and awkward, did not bother to answer. He saw the Prince of Wales beat a man down with his axe, and saw a Frenchman plunge a shortened lance that ripped open the prince's jupon. Beneath the jupon, the prince's cuirass was sculpted with his coat of arms. The lance thrust again, and the prince slashed the axe down onto the assailant's shoulder. The Dauphin saw the big blade bite through the armour, and saw the blood spray, sudden and bright. "Back, your highness," one of the Dauphin's guards said. That guardian could see that the enemy prince was determined to fight his way through to the heir to the French throne. That could not happen. And the English were fighting like demons, so it might happen if he did not act. "Back, your highness," he said again, and this time pulled the Dauphin away. The Dauphin was speechless. He had surprised himself by how little fear he had felt once the battle began. True, he was well guarded, and the men charged with his safety were all brutally efficient fighters, but the Dauphin had tried to do his best. He had thrust a sword hard at an enemy knight and thought he had hurt the man. Most of all, he had been fascinated. He had observed the battle with an intelligent eye, and, though he was appalled at the butchery, he found it intriguing. It was a stupid way to decide great matters, he thought. for the decision was surely a lottery once the brawling began. There had to be a cleverer way to defeat the enemy. "Back, sire!" a man bellowed at him, and the Dauphin allowed himself to be drawn back through the gap in the hedge. How long had they been fighting, he wondered. It seemed like minutes, but now he saw that the sun was high above the trees, and so it must have been at least an hour. "Time flies," he said. "Did you speak, sire?" a man shouted. "I said time flies." "Christ Jesus," the man said. He watched the Prince of Wales, who was standing cocksure above the men he had beaten down with his bloodied axe. The prince shook the axe at the retreating enemy. "Come back!" he bellowed. "He's a fool," the Dauphin said in puzzlement. "Sire?" "I said he's a fool." "A fighting fool," the man said in grudging admiration. "He's enjoying this," the Dauphin said. "Why wouldn't he, sire?" "Only a fool could enjoy it. To a fool this is paradise, and he's wallowing in idiocy." The man in charge of the Dauphin's guards thought the 18-year-old prince was mad, and he felt a surge of anger that he was trusted with the life of this pale-faced, hollow-chested weakling with his short legs and long arms, and now, it seemed, with a brain made of soft cheese. A prince should look like a prince, like the Prince of Wales. The Frenchman hated to admit it, but the enemy prince looked like a proper ruler in his broad-chested, blood-splattered glory. He looked like a real warrior, not like this pale shred of an excuse for a man. But the pale shred was the Dauphin, and so the man kept his voice respectful. "We must send messengers to your father," he said, "to the king." "I know who my father is. We must request him to send more men, sire." "Do so," the Dauphin said, "but make sure he sends his most foolish fools." "Fools, sire." "Send the messengers, do it now." So the French sent for help. The huge man with the morning star rushed at Thomas, while his companions, one with the flail and the other with an axe, charged with him. They bellowed their challenges as they came. Thomas was flanked by Carol and by Arnaldus, hardened men both, one German, one Gascon, and Carol faced the man with the poleaxe while Arnaldus was challenged by the steel-faced man with the war flail. Thomas still carried the shortened lance. He dropped it. The morning star swung. Thomas, looking up, saw drops of blood being flicked from its spikes as it seared through the sky. He himself had no weapon now, so he just stepped forward inside the swing and put his archer's arms around the tall man and squeezed as he lifted. Arnaldus had taken the flail's blow on his shield. Now, with his right hand, he chopped the axe down on his assailant's leg. Carol had followed Thomas's example and stepped inside the poleaxe's long swing and rammed his mace into his enemy's groin. He rammed it again. Thomas heard a squeal. He was holding on to his enemy. The flail scraped down his back, tearing mail and leather. More Frenchmen were coming, but so were more Harlequin. The man with the poleaxe was bent double, and that was an invitation to Carol, who took it gratefully. He held his mace close to its head, shortened the swing, and slammed it onto the nape of the Frenchman's neck, once, twice, and the man went down in silence, and Carol drew a dagger and prized up the lower rim of the breastplate worn by the huge man clasped in Thomas's arms. Carol slid the dagger up under the man's ribs. "Jesus! Jesus!" the man screamed. Thomas tightened the embrace. The big man should have let go of the morning star and tried to break Thomas's neck, but he stubbornly held the weapon as Carol wriggled his long, thin blade, and the man screamed louder. Thomas smelt shit. He was squeezing as hard as he could, and Carol thrust the dagger again, ramming it up under the breastplate's edge so that his bloodied gauntlet vanished under the steel and into the mangled mail and wool. "You can drop him now," Carol said. The man fell heavily. He was jerking, gasping. "Poor bastard," Carol said. "Should have known better." He picked up his mace, put a foot on the squirming man's chest, and slammed the mace down hard onto his helmet. "Oh, good luck in hell," Carol said. "Say hello to the devil for us." The French were pulling back, step by step, watching their enemy, but going back along the edge or else trying to force a way through the tangling brambles. The English and Gascons did not follow. Men on horseback behind the line were bellowing at them, "Keep the line, no pursuit, let them go." The temptation was to pursue the French and capture rich prisoners, but such a pursuit would break the line open, and if the French had failed to do that with steel, then the English would not do it themselves with greed. They stayed in line. "You should try fighting with a weapon," Carol said to Thomas, amused. Thomas was dry-mouthed. He could hardly speak, but as the French went, so the women from the English baggage came with wineskins filled with river water. There was not enough for everyone to slake their thirst, but men drank what they could. And trumpets sounded in the valley. The enemy was coming again. The first messenger to reach the king was dusty. Sweat had made channels through the dust on his face. His horse was white with sweat. He dismounted and knelt. "My liege," he said, "the prince, your son, requests reinforcements." The king was gazing at the far hill. He could see the English banners through the widest gap in the hedge. "What happened?" he asked. "The enemy is weakened, sire, very weakened, but not broken, no, sire." Two more messengers came, and the king pieced together an account of what had happened so far that morning. The messengers heaped praise on his elder son, saying the Dauphin had fought magnificently, stories that the king disbelieved but pretended to accept. What did seem true was that the English had indeed been weakened, but had kept their discipline and held their line intact. "They are stubborn, sire," one of the messengers said. "Ah, yes, stubborn," the king said vaguely. He watched his eldest son's troops come back down the far hill. They came slowly. They must have been weary because it had been a long fight. Most clashes of men-at-arms were over in minutes, but the two armies must have fought for at least an hour. The king watched a wounded man limp up the hill, using a sword as a stave to support his weight. "My son is unwounded?" he asked the messenger. "Yes, sire. Thank God, sire." "Thank God indeed," the king said, then beckoned to the Count of Ventador. "Go to the Dauphin," he ordered him, "and tell him he is to leave the field." "Leave the field?" The Count was not certain he had heard correctly. "He is the heir. He fought enough, he has proved his courage, and now he must be kept safe. Tell him he is to ride to Poitiers with his entourage. I shall join him there this evening." "Yes, sire," the Count said, and called for his horse. He knew he was being sent with the message because the Dauphin would distrust such a command unless it was brought by a man close to the king, and the Count decided the king was right. The heir to the throne must be kept safe. "And tell the Duke of Orleans to take up the fight," the king commanded. "He is to advance, sire." "He is to advance, he is to fight, and he is to win," the king said. He looked at his youngest son, just 14. "You will not leave with Charles," he said. "I don't want to leave, father." "You will witness victory, Philippe." "Shall we fight, father?" the boy asked eagerly. "Your uncle will fight next. We shall join him if we're needed." "I hope he needs us," Philippe said. King Jean smiled. He did not want to deprive his youngest son of any of the day's excitement, though he desperately wanted him kept safe. Perhaps, he thought, he would advance his 3,000 men at the battle's end to join in the destruction of the English. His men were among the finest knights and men-at-arms that France possessed, which was why they served in the King's battle. "You will see some fighting," he promised his son, "but you must swear not to leave my side." "I swear it, father." The Count of Ventador had ridden his horse through the mass of men commanded by the king's brother. That was the shortest way to the Dauphin. The king saw him deliver the message to the Duke, then ride on to find the Dauphin, who was now halfway down the far slope. The English had not pursued him. They just waited behind the hedge, a sign, the king hoped, that they truly were weakened. "When the Duke attacks," the king called to Marshal Claymore, "we will advance our battle to his present position." "Yes, sire." The first hammer blow had weakened the English. Two more waited. And then, only one waited. Because, as the king watched in disbelief, his brother decided to leave the field with the Dauphin. The Duke of Orleans had not fought. His swords were unstained by enemy blood, yet he called for his horses and led his troops northwards. "What the devil?" the king asked the morning air. "What in Christ's name is he doing?" Marshal Claymore asked. "Sweet Jesus," a man said. "He's leaving!" "You fool!" the king screamed at his brother, who was much too far away to hear. "You spavined fool, you coward, you cretinous bastard, you gutless turd!" His face was red, spittle flying from his mouth. "Advance the banners!" the king shouted. He dismounted and gave the reins of his horse to a groom. If his brother would not fight, then the king's battle, the finest in the army, would have to decide the day. "Trumpets!" the king shouted, still angrily. "Give me that damned axe! Sound the trumpets! Sound the advance! Forward!" The trumpets sounded, the drums beat, and the oriflamme was carried towards the enemy. "What are they doing?" The Prince of Wales had mounted his horse so that he could see the enemy better, and what he saw was worrying. The French second battle was going northwards. "They plan to attack our right flank?" he suggested. "And our centre at same time, sire." Sir Reginald Cobham, old in war, was watching the last French battle advance. This was the battle that flew the oriflamme and the royal standard. Sir Reginald leaned forward and slapped at a horsefly that had settled on his destrier's neck. "Maybe someone over there has some sense at last." "The Earl of Salisbury has archers?" the prince asked. "Plenty, but does he have enough arrows?" The prince grunted. A servant brought him a pitcher of wine diluted with water, but the prince shook his head. "Make sure every other man drinks before I do," he ordered in a voice loud enough to be heard 30 or 40 paces away. "A carter brought 10 barrels of water up the hill, sire," the Earl of Warwick said. "He did? Good man!" The prince looked at a servant. "Find him! Give him a mark!" The silver mark was a valuable coin. "No, give him 2! They're not very eager, are they?" He was looking at the Duke of Orleans' troops, whom he had presumed were about to attack the Earl of Salisbury's men on the English right, but to his bemusement, those enemy troops were heading even farther north. Some had mounted their horses, some walked, and some lingered in the valley's bed as though uncertain what they should do. "Jean!" the prince called. "My lord!" Jean de Grail, Captal de Bou, who had stayed close to the prince for much of the battle, nudged his horse closer. "Sire?" "What are those devils doing?" Mounted attack," the Captal suggested, but he sounded very uncertain. If the French did plan a charge of mounted knights, then they were taking their horses a long way from the English line. Some had already vanished over the distant skyline. "Or perhaps they want to be the first into the whorehouses at Poitiers," the Captal suggested. "What sensible fellows they are," the prince said. He frowned, watching the receding troops. About half of the Duke of Orleans' battle were going northwards, the other half had stayed where they were to be joined by the Dauphin's men who had already fought. Then some of those began to follow the Duke of Orleans' banner northwards. That banner, instead of being carried towards the right of the English line, was heading steadily north and westwards. "By God," the prince said in astonishment, "I do believe you're right. They're racing to get the best horse. Giddy up, fellows!" He shouted the encouragement towards the disappearing enemy, then patted his horse. "Not you, old fellow. You have to stay here." He looked back to the French king's troops, who were now advancing towards him. "He must be very confident," he said, "to send troops away." "Or very foolish," the Earl of Warwick said. There were a dozen horsemen about the prince. They were the wise men, the experienced men, their eyes creased from staring at distant enemies, their skin darkened by the sun, their armour scratched and dented and their weapon hilts worn smooth from use. They had fought in Normandy, Brittany, Gascony, France and Scotland, and they trusted each other and, more importantly, the prince trusted them. "And to think," the prince said, "that this morning I was expecting to be a hostage." "I'm sure Jean de Valois would accept the offer now, sire," the Earl of Warwick said, refusing to call Jean the King of France, a title claimed by Edward of England. "I don't believe what I think I'm watching," the prince said. He was frowning at the retreating French troops, who really did seem to be leaving the battlefield, not just the Dauphin's tired men, but the Duke of Orleans' fresh troops as well. Some had remained on the field, and those men were joining the king's battle. "I suppose they think those fellows are sufficient," he pointed at the approaching men-at-arms. The king's great standard, flamboyant in blue and gold, had reached the valley's bottom, and now the great spread of armoured men began to climb. "My lord," the prince turned to the captal, "you have horsemen?" "I have 60 men mounted, sire. The rest are in the line." 60, the prince said thoughtfully. He glanced back at the approaching French. 60 was not enough. His battered army might have around the same number of men as the King of France's approaching battle, but the enemy was fresh. The prince's men were tired, and he did not want to weaken his exhausted line by taking men-at-arms from the ranks. But then a happy thought occurred. "Take 100 archers with you, all mounted." "Sire," the Earl of Warwick asked, wondering what the prince was thinking. "They plan to strike us hard," the prince said. "So let's see how they like being struck themselves." He turned back to the captal. "Let them engage us first, my lord, then strike from the rear." The captal was smiling. It was not a pleasant smile. "I need an English flag, sire." "So they know who's killing them?" "So your archers don't use our horses for target practice, sire." "My God," Warwick said. "You're going to charge an army with 160 men." "No, we're going to slaughter an army," the prince said. "With the help of God, St. George, and Gascony." The prince leaned from the saddle and clasped the captal's hand. "Go with God, my lord, and fight like the devil." "Even the devil doesn't fight like a Gascon, sire." The prince laughed. He smelt victory. Roland de Verec had spent the battle on horseback. He would have felt uncomfortable fighting on foot, not because he had no skills at such combat, but because he had no close friends in the battle line. Men fought in pairs or in groups, united by kingship or friendship, and sworn to each other's defence. Roland de Verec had no kin in this army, and his friendships were tenuous, and besides, he wanted to find his enemy. When the French had first burst through the gaps in their hedge to drive the English line backwards, Roland had searched the banners for the green horse of La Boyard and had not seen it, so he had stood his destrier close to the Prince of Wales, though not so close that he would be noticed, and he had gazed through the hedge's widest gap trying to find the green horse among the two battles waiting to attack, and still he had not spied it. That was hardly surprising. The waiting battles were flamboyant with banners, flags, and pennants, and there was little wind to spread them. So little wind that the man holding the oriflamme was waving it from side to side so it would be noticed. That pennant was a ripple of bright red that was drawing ever closer to the English hill. Robbie had joined him. The Scotsman, like Roland, was friendless in this army. It was true that he counted Thomas as a friend, but that friendship was marked by generosity on one side and ingratitude on the other, and Robbie felt shamed. In time, the friendship could be mended, but for now, Robbie did not think Thomas would trust him as a neighbour in battle, and so, like Roland, he had watched the fight from behind the line. He had watched the English take the French charge, stop it and repel it. He had heard the misery of battle, the screams of men being mangled by steel. He had watched the French try again and again to break the line and seen them lose heart. They had retreated. They left bodies behind. More bodies than the English, many more. But then it was always easier to defend. The English had to hold their line. Men who were reluctant to fight had small choice but to stay with their neighbours. They did not need to step forward and initiate battle, but the French had to advance. The more timid would hang back, leaving the bravest to fight, which meant the bravest were often isolated, set upon by half a dozen defenders, and it had been the French who had suffered most through their bravery. Now it would all start again. "What happens now?" Roland asked suddenly. Robbie gazed at the approaching French. "They come. They fight. Who knows?" "I didn't mean that," Roland said. He too watched the approaching French. "They saved their best to last," he added. "Their best?" Roland could see some of the banners now because the standard-bearers were waving them to and fro. "The Ventador," he said. "Damatin, Brienne, Eu, Bourbon, Pommier, and the Royal Standard too." "So what did you mean?" "I mean, what happens after the battle?" "You marry Bertie." "With God's help, yes," Roland said, touching the blue silk scarf at his neck. "And you?" Robbie shrugged. "I stay with Thomas, I think." "You won't go home?" "I doubt there'll be a welcome for me in Liddesdale. Not anymore. I'll have to make a new home." Roland nodded. He still watched the approaching battle. "And I shall have to make peace with France," he said wistfully. Robbie patted the neck of his horse, a piebald destrier that had been a gift from Thomas. "I thought your lands were in Gascony." "They are." "Then do homage to the Prince of Wales, he'll restore your lands." Roland shook his head. "I'm French," he said, "and I will ask France's forgiveness." He sighed. "I suppose it will cost money, but anything is possible with money." "Just make sure you kill him quickly," Robbie said. "I'll help you." Roland did not respond at once. He had seen a flash of green in the enemy ranks and was watching the place. Was it a green horse? "Quickly," he asked after a while, still staring. "Did you think I would torment La Bruyere to death?" He sounded offended. "He might deserve torment, but his death will be quick. I mean kill him before he has a chance to surrender." Roland at last turned from the approaching French. His visor was lifted and he was frowning. "Surrender?" "La Bruyère's worth a fortune," Robbie said. "If the battle goes badly for him, he'll surrender. He'd much rather pay a ransom than be buried. Wouldn't you?" "My God," Roland said. He had never thought of that possibility, but it was so obvious. He had dreamed of freeing Bertie with the sword, but Robbie was right. La Bruyère would never fight. He would yield. "So kill him very quickly," Robbie said. "Don't give him a chance to say anything. Get in fast, ignore his pleas for mercy, and kill him." He paused, watching Roland, who had looked back to the advancing enemy. "If he's even there," Robbie added. "He's there," Roland said bitterly. He had seen the green horse now. It was on the left of the French line, at the back of the King's battle. Somehow he would need to cut his way through that line if he was ever to free Bertie, and he knew that would be hopeless. He would have to kill too many men, and even if he succeeded, he would give La Bruyère far too much time to see his death approaching. Robbie was right. He needed to do the killing fast, and he did not see how that could be done. And just then there was a crash of hooves. He turned and saw horsemen assembling beneath the trees, and he guessed they were readying to make a charge. "I need a lance," he said. "We need 2 lancers," Robbie said. They turned their horses and went to find lances. The Count of La Bruyère tripped on something. He still had his visor lifted, but it was difficult to look down because his helmet's lower rim, which covered his jaw, grated on his mail aventail and against the top of his thick breastplate. But he caught a glimpse of a discarded mace, smeared with blood and human hair. His bowels lurched. There was more blood on the ground, evidently left by a wounded man limping or crawling back from the first assault on the English line. He slowed his pace, making certain he was at the very back of the King's battle. The drums were close behind him, the drummers making a huge, ear-pummeling noise as their clubbed sticks thumped on the stretched goat skins. Armour clinked. The Count was soaked in sweat. It was running down his face and stinging his eyes. He was tired from the long walk down from the flat hilltop, and it was worse now because he was going gently uphill, every step an effort. His leg muscles nothing but ache, and his stomach was churning while his bowels had turned to water. He stumbled on a trampled vine, but managed to keep his footing. Trumpets called. "No arrows!" someone shouted. "The bastards have run out of arrows! You can keep your visors up!" another man called. And just then an arrow flashed in from the left, slashing down into the ranks and glancing off a vambrace to bury its bodkin point in the earth. More arrows came, and all through the French ranks men fumbled to close their visors. The sound of arrows striking armour was like metal hail. A drummer was hit and he fell back. his vast drum on top of his bleeding stomach as he threw up a mixture of vomit and blood. "Oh God," the Count of La Bruyere moaned. The wine slopped in his belly. He felt sick. So many men had drunk their way to courage, and now the wine was sour, and he stumbled as he struggled onwards. He could see almost nothing through the narrow slits of his visor. All he wanted was to keep his bowels closed and for this hell to be over. Pray God that the enthusiastic fools at the front of the attack surged through the English line and killed the enemy fools. With any luck, he would take a prisoner worth a large ransom, but in truth he did not really care. He just wanted this to be finished. The arrows dwindled. The archers on the right of the English line had only a handful left, and most of them discarded their bows and picked up poleaxes or maces, then watched the enemy close on the hedge. The King of France was walking towards the widest gap in the hedge where he could see the great banner that proclaimed the presence of the Prince of Wales. His son Philippe was beside him, and his bodyguard all around him. 17 other men were dressed in the king's colours, dressed to deceive the English. They were all renowned knights, members of the King's Order of the Star, and the hope was that the English would die in attacking them and so weaken themselves. "You stay close behind me, Philippe," the king said to his son. "Yes, father." "Tonight we feast in Poitiers," the king said. "We'll have music." "And prisoners?" "Dozens of prisoners," King Jean said. "Hundreds of prisoners." "And we'll make you a nightshirt from the Prince of Wales' jupon." Philippe laughed. He carried a sword and a shield, though no one expected him to fight, and 4 Knights of the Star were detailed to protect him. The front ranks of the French were converging on the gap in the hedge now. "Montjoie Saint-Denis!" they shouted. "Montjoie Saint-Denis!" The attacking line was ragged. The enthusiastic had forged ahead, the reluctant had deliberately slowed, and the French line was misshapen. The English were silent. The king had a glimpse of them through the ranks in front of him and saw a grey line of battered steel beneath tattered flags. "Saint-Denis!" he shouted. "Montjoie Saint-Denis!" The Cardinal Bessières was 100 paces behind the French attack. He was still mounted and escorted by Father Marchand and 3 men-at-arms. The Cardinal was livid. The French army was supposedly led by men who knew their business, men experienced in warfare, yet the first attacks by horsemen had failed utterly, the second attack had been repulsed, and now at least half of the army had left the field, some without even trying to fight. What should have been an easy victory was being weighed in the balance, yet despite his anger he was still confident. The king's battle was the strongest of the 3 and filled with men of high reputation. They were fresh, the enemy was tired, and with God's help the king should prevail. The oriflamme still flew. The cardinal considered saying a prayer, but he had never been confident of God's help, preferring to rely on his own intelligence and cunning. "When this debacle is over," he said to Father Marchand, "make sure you retrieve La Malice from that Scottish animal." "Of course, Your Eminence." And to the cardinal's surprise, the recollection of St. Peter's sword gave him a sudden surge of hope. He, above all men, knew the tawdry nature of most relics and the deceit that such things played on the credulous. Any scrap of old bone, whether from a goat, a bullock, or an executed thief, could be palmed off as a knuckle of a martyr. Yet, despite his scepticism, he felt a certainty that La Malice was indeed the sword of the fisherman. It could not fail. The angels themselves would fight for France, and victory would propel Louis Bessières onto the throne of St. Peter. "Now go!" the cardinal called to the men in front, though they were too far away to hear him, and the French charged. "Montjoie Saint-Denis!" Thomas rode north along the English line. He could hear the French approaching, their big drums pounding the air, and he was curious to discover what was happening. So far his battle had been the short, vicious repulse of the horsemen by the ford, and then the equally short and savage battle inside the hedge. What had happened on the rest of the field was a mystery, and so he rode to find out, and he saw, through the widest gap in the hedge, another French attack surging forward. What was strange was that there were no more Frenchmen on the distant skyline, except for a scatter of horsemen who appeared, like him, to be watching the battle. He was about to turn back to tell his men what he had discovered and to warn them to be ready for another fight along the hedge, when a voice shouted, "Are you an archer?" Thomas assumed the question was directed at someone else and ignored it. Then it struck him as strange that the question should have been asked in French. He turned and saw a man in a black livery on which a yellow shield was decorated with silver scallops. The man was staring straight at Thomas. "I'm an archer," Thomas called back. "I need mounted archers." The man was young, but had an unmistakable air of confidence and authority. "Bring hand weapons." "I can give you at least 60 archers," Thomas called back. "Be quick!" The French came through the gap, screaming their war cry, and just as before, they crashed into the English line, and just as before, steel met steel. "Hold fast!" a man bellowed in English. "Hold the line!" Trumpets raked the sky with noise, the drummers hammered their skins, the war cries were shouted, and Thomas rode, only stopping when he reached the southern end of the line, which was still unengaged. "Carol, it's the same fight as before. Just hold them. Sam, I want every archer on his horse. Bring axes, swords, maces, anything that kills, and hurry." Thomas wondered who the man in the black jupon was, or what in God's name he had just agreed to do. His men were running to the tree line where Keane had picketed the horses. "Keane!" Thomas shouted. "Give me a poleaxe!" The Irishman brought a poleaxe, then mounted his own horse. "I'm coming. Where are we going?" "I've no idea." "A mystery ride, is it? We used to do that at home. Just ride off and see where we ended. Usually an alehouse." "I doubt that's our destination," Thomas said, then raised his voice. "Come with me!" He kicked the horse back north. To his left, the battle was loud. The English line was 4 men deep, and it was holding. The men in the rear ranks were bracing the front rank or thrusting with shortened lances between their comrades' bodies, while behind the line 2 horsemen were jabbing lances at an enemy whose visor was lifted. There was a mass of Frenchmen in the hedge's gap where banners waved, but most were still beyond the hedge, waiting for their leading men to hack out a space they could fill. "Follow me!" the man in the black jupon shouted. He had 60 or so men wearing his black and yellow colours, and Thomas and his archers followed them into the trees. More archers joined, all following the man in black northwards. Thomas saw Robbie and Roland riding together, and he kicked his horse to catch up with them. "What are we doing?" "Attacking from behind," Robbie said. He grinned. "Who's leading?" "The Captal de Bout," Roland said. "Captal? A Gascon title. He has a reputation." My God, Thomas thought, but he needs to be good. As far as he could see, the Captal had fewer than 200 men, and he planned to assault the French army. And most of those men were mounted archers, not trained men-at-arms. But if the Captal felt any trepidation, he did not betray it. He led the men down the hill, staying in the woods and going far behind the Earl of Salisbury's battle that defended the right-hand end of the English line. The fighting was fierce there. Much of the Earl's position was beyond the hedge, and the slope leading to the English line was gentle, and so the French assailed around the hedge's northern end to be met by men-at-arms and archers. Trenches trapped some Frenchmen. Archers fought with hand weapons, using their bow-given strength to batter armoured men. Thomas had a glimpse of that fight, then he was in the trees again. Acorns crunched under the hooves of his horse. Men ducked beneath the branches of oak and chestnuts. A handful of the men-at-arms carried long lances that had to be steered carefully between the thick trees, but they were not going fast. The strength of the horses needed to be conserved, and so the Captal led them at a trot, confident that he was hidden from the enemy. The sound of the battle faded as they rode farther north. They rode into a valley, crossed the trickle of a stream, and climbed the further slope that was a field of stubble. Trees screened the northern and western skylines. Just before they reached the northern trees, the Captal turned his horse to the left and rode into a thicket of oak that crowned a hill. When Thomas ducked into the trees, he could see that the low hills to the north were covered with retreating men. Why? Had the French suffered a defeat that had escaped his notice? Yet there they were, hundreds and hundreds of men going northwards, while the battle was still being fought on the English hill. A small lizard skittered across Thomas's path. Was that a good omen or bad? He wished he still had the dried dog paw he used to wear as a talisman about his neck, a paw he had boasted to be a relic of St. Gimfor, a dog that had been declared a saint. How could a dog be a saint? He made the sign of the cross, remembering that he had not confessed before this battle and he had not received any absolution. If he was killed, he thought, he would go to hell. He touched the paw again and curbed his horse. All the horses were standing now, pawing the ground and tossing their heads. "Standard bearer!" the captal called. "Sire, the English flag!" The standard bearer unfurled the white flag with the bold red cross of St. George. "Weapons, gentlemen!" the captal said in heavily accented English. He grinned, and his teeth looked very white against his sun-darkened skin, which was shadowed by his helmet. "Now let's destroy them!" With those words, he spurred his horse out of the trees. The men-at-arms and archers followed, and as Thomas rode into the sunlight, he suddenly saw the French army crowded at the hedge, and he saw that the captal had led them in a wide circle so that they were now riding at the French from the rear. The men-at-arms with lances held the weapons upright. All the long lances bore a black and yellow pennant, the captal's colours. There was a small hedge in front of them, but there were gaps, and the horsemen streamed through, reforming on the far side as the captal spurred into a canter. Thomas's world was the thud of hooves, a devil's thud, counterpointing the drums of the French, who seemed oblivious of the horsemen coming from behind. They were riding on grassland now. Thomas kicked his horse into a canter, not far. The French were just 2 bowshots away, and the 160 horsemen were spreading out, down into the small coombe, then up the slope where the horses trampled the broken grapevines. The flag of St. George was high, the lances were lowered to the charge, the spurs went back, and a man screamed, "St. George! Sanctiterra!" a Gascon shouted. "And kill them!" the captal bellowed. And the horsemen let their destriers and coursers run, and the French rear flanks, where the more timid men sheltered, turned to see the great beasts and armoured men crashing down on them, and they broke even before the charge slammed home. Flags fell, men began to run, clumsy in their armour, and then the horses were among them, and the lances slid into steel-clad bodies, and axes swung to splinter backplates and shatter bone, and to mist the autumn air with blood. And Thomas heard himself shouting like a fiend and feeling utter exhilaration. "St. George!" And he slammed the spike at the end of the poleaxe into a Frenchman's helmet and let the momentum of his horse drag the weapon free. A knackerer let his vast drum fall and ran, but a horseman turned and casually split the man's skull with a sword before turning back to attack a French knight. He swung again, and his sword shattered the Frenchman's sword. A horse reared and beat a man down with its hooves. Sam was killing crossbowmen with an axe. "I hate bloody crossbowmen," he shouted, and dropped the axe blade onto a man's head. "Like cracking an egg," he shouted at Thomas. "Who's next?" "Stay together," the captal shouted. They were only 160 strong, and the King of France's battle was 3,000 men, but the 160 had shattered the rear ranks of the French, who were now desperately running back towards the west. The front ranks, fighting beyond the hedge, heard the panic, and the whole battle moved backwards as the English line roared in triumph and moved forward. More horsemen appeared, this time from the southern end of the line, a more ragged charge of men coming to complete the panic. And the French had indeed panicked. They were fleeing, all of them, and the captal bellowed at his men to pull back. 160 men had broken an army, but they were still hugely outnumbered, and the French were realizing it and forming lines to resist the horsemen. 3 of them caught Pitt, the taciturn archer, and Thomas watched, horrified as they cut his horse down with axes, dragged Pitt from the saddle, and beat him to death with maces. Thomas rode at them, reaching them too late, but swinging the poleaxe wildly and slamming the blade into a man's neck. "Bastards!" he shouted, then twisted his horse fast away from their axe blows. He followed the captal north, just out of range of the French weapons. The prince's men had come through the hedge and were falling on the French, who again broke in panic. They fled, pursued by the dismounted men-at-arms coming in ever greater numbers through the hedge, and by the horsemen who had appeared to the south. It was like shepherding a flock of sheep. The horsemen rode and threatened, and the French made no effort to reform but kept going westwards. The oriflamme had vanished, but Thomas could see the blue and gold of the French royal standard still flying in the centre of the disorganised mass. More and more of the English and Gascon men-at-arms had fetched their horses, and more came to join the pursuit. Down into the shallow valley they went, then up to the flat top of Le Champ d'Alexandre from which the French had attacked that morning, and now it was the horsemen who attacked. Groups of men rode into the disorganized French, weapons swinging, horses snapping at men, and the French panic grew desperate as their ranks were split. Small groups stayed together and tried to defend themselves. The nobles were shouting that they were rich, that they surrendered. English archers, their bows discarded, were using their huge strength to wield axes, maces and hammers. Men bellowed in bloodlust or in terror. All order had now vanished from the French, who were being broken into smaller and smaller groups, assailed by battle-maddened men with sweaty faces and gritted teeth who only wanted to kill, and so they did. A Frenchman fended off two archers, using his sword to foil their axes. Then he stepped back and tripped on a fallen man and went down, and the archers jumped forward, axes swinging, and the Frenchman screamed as a blade crashed into his shoulder. He tried to stand, fell back again, and swung his sword in a great sweep that parried an axe. Thomas could see the man gritting his teeth, his whole face distorted with his desperate efforts. He parried another axe, then cried out as the second archer chopped into the meat of his thigh. He tried to lunge his sword at the man, spitting out teeth he had shattered because he had bitten down so hard, but his desperate lunge was parried. Then an axe crunched down into his face, and a poleaxe spike rammed into his belly, and his whole body jerked in a great spasm as he died. For a moment his helmet's open face filled with blood, then it drained away as the two archers knelt to search his body. Keane had dismounted and was standing over a corpse whose belly had been split open by the Irishman's poleaxe. The man's guts had been trampled into the stubble, while next to the corpse, and wearing the same livery of yellow circles on a blue field, was an older man with a pale, lined face, grey hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore plate armour with a golden crucifix emblazoned on his breastplate. He looked terrified. He had plainly surrendered to Keane because the Irishman was holding the man's helmet that had a cross on its chest and a long blue plume trailing behind. "He says he's the Archbishop of Sens," Keane said to Thomas. "Then you're rich. Hold on to him. Make sure no one steals him from you." "This fellow tried to protect him." Keane looked down at the disemboweled man. "Wasn't a clever decision, really." There was a wild melee in the centre of the field, and Thomas, looking that way, saw the French royal standard still flying. Men were hacking at the standard's defenders, wild in their savagery as they tried to cut through to King Jean. Thomas ignored it, riding southwards to see men fleeing down the hill towards the Moisson, but the Earl of Warwick's archers were waiting there, and the Frenchmen were fleeing towards death. A man hailed Thomas, and he turned to see Jake, one of the archers, leading a prisoner on a horse. The man wore a jupon, showing a clenched red fist against a field of orange and white stripes, and Thomas could not help but laugh. It was Jocelyn of Bernard, the man sworn to retake Castillon d'Arbizon. "He says he'll only surrender to you," Jake said, "on account that I'm not a gentleman." "Nor am I," Thomas said, then spoke in French. "You are my prisoner," he told Jocelyn. "Fate," Jocelyn said resignedly. "King," Thomas bellowed. "Another one here to guard. Look after them both. They're rich." Thomas looked back to Jake. "Guard them well." Men squabbled over the ownership of prisoners, but Thomas reckoned there were enough Harlequin to keep the Archbishop and the Count of Bernard from being poached by other men. Thomas spurred northwards. More Frenchmen were fleeing that way, desperate to reach the safety of Poitiers. A few, very few, had managed to find their horses or else had taken a horse from an Englishman. Most ran or stumbled, harried all the way by vengeful pursuers. But one man rode straight towards Thomas, who recognised the piebald destrier and then the red heart of Douglas, though the surcoat was so sodden with blood that for a moment Thomas thought it was coloured black. "Robbie!" he called, glad to see his friend. Then he saw that the rider was not Robbie, but Scully. "He's dead," Scully shouted. "The traitor's dead, and it's your turn now." He was carrying La Malice. The blade looked pathetically rusted and weak, but it was also discoloured by blood. "It looks like shit," Scully said, "but it's a canny weapon." He had lost his helmet, and his long, lank hair rattled with bones. "I took wee Robbie's head off," Scully said. "One cut of the magic sword and wee Robbie went to hell. See?" He grinned and pointed to his saddle where Thomas saw Robbie's bloody head was hanging by its hair. "I like a wee keepsake from a fight, and the sight of that will make his uncle happy." He laughed at Thomas's expression. No one was attacking the Scotsman because any Englishman or Gascon assumed a horseman who was not fleeing northwards must be on their side, even if, like Scully, he did not wear a red cross of St. George. Now Scully curbed his stolen horse. "Would you rather just surrender to me?" he asked, then suddenly rowelled his spurs so that the destrier charged straight at Thomas, who, taken by surprise, could only thrust his poleaxe at the Scotsman, who easily avoided the clumsy blow and swept the ancient blade hard at Thomas's neck, trying to take his head as he had taken Robbie's. Thomas jerked the axe back and upwards, and somehow managed to parry the blow. The two weapons met with violent force, and Thomas thought the old sword must break, but La Malice was still in one piece, and Scully backswung it with malevolent speed. Thomas ducked. La Malice's blade hit his bassinet and scraped across the crown, and Thomas instinctively wrenched his horse to the left and saw the sword coming back, snake fast, in a cut aimed at his face. He somehow leaned out of the way, aware of the broad tip of the sword flashing perilously close. He tried to lunge the poleaxe's spiked tip at the Scotsman, but Scully just parried the heavy blade and struck again, this time slamming La Malice hard down, and the blade clashed onto Thomas's helmet so fiercely that he was half stunned, his ears ringing. But the bassinet steel resisted the blade, even though he was slumped in the saddle, grunting, trying to gather his wits and make room to swing his poleaxe. "Christ's bowels, you're feeble," Scully taunted. He grinned, prodded Thomas with the sword, and laughed when Thomas swayed in the saddle. "Time to say hello to the devil, Englishman," Scully said, and drew La Malice back for the killing blow, and Thomas dropped the axe, kicked his left foot free of the stirrup, and lunged at the Scotsman. He threw his arms around Scully's chest and held on, gripping him, tearing Scully out of the saddle so that they both thumped onto the ground. And Thomas was on top. He used his archer's strength to punch Scully in the face, his ironclad gauntlet shattering a cheekbone and nose. He hit him again, and Scully tried to bite him, and Thomas drove his gauntlet down again, this time with outthrust rigid fingers that drove into Scully's left eyeball. The Scotsman gave a gurgling scream as the eye collapsed. Then Thomas headbutted him with his helmet and rolled off. He seized Scully's right arm and wrenched the sword free. "Bastard," he said, and he held the sword in both hands, left hand on the hilt, right on the back blade, and he drove the foredge into Scully's throat and sawed it hard so that he cut through gullet and blood vessels and sinew and muscle, and Scully still gurgled, and blood jetted onto Thomas's face, and he went on pushing as the blood pulsed warm, and the pulses slowly slackened, and still Thomas sawed and pushed, until the old blade met bone, and Scully was dead. "Jesus," Thomas said. "Sweet Jesus." He was on his knees, shaking. He stared at the sword. A miracle? He saw that someone had made a new wooden hilt for the ancient blade, and that hilt was slick with blood. He stood. Robbie's horse was beside him, and, in a spasm of anger, he cut the hair that held Robbie's head. It thumped on the ground. He would have to find the rest of his old friend and dig a grave. But before he could think how he might do that, he saw Roland de Verrec standing helpless in front of a fat man in armour. The fat man had a green and white jupon and, as Thomas watched, he drew his sword and held it towards Roland. It was the Count of La Boyare. There was shit dribbling down the back of his armoured legs. "I am your prisoner," he announced loudly. Thomas walked towards the two men. Sam and a half-dozen archers had seen Thomas, and they now rode towards him, bringing Thomas's horse with them. "He surrendered," Roland called to Thomas. Thomas said nothing, kept walking. "I have yielded," the Count said loudly, "and will pay a ransom." "Kill the fat bastard," Sam called. "No," Roland de Verrec held up his hand. "You cannot kill him. That is dishonorable." He stumbled over the English word. "Dishonourable?" Sam asked, incredulous. "Sir Thomas," Roland called, desperately unhappy. "A man who has surrendered is safe, is he not?" Thomas ignored Roland, seeming not even to see him. He still said nothing. He walked up to the Count, who was holding his sword out in surrender. "Chivalry dictates that he must be kept alive," Roland said. "Is that not so, Sir Thomas?" Thomas had not even looked at Roland. He just gazed at the Count, and then, almost as fast as Scully, he backswung La Malice so that the blade chopped into the Count's neck. The sword sliced beneath the helmet's rim, cutting through the aventail to bite deep into the fat neck. And Thomas sawed it back, thrust it forward with an archer's strength, and was hit by even more blood as the Count of La Boyard sank to his knees, and Thomas gouged the blade deeper and deeper until the life went from La Boyard's eyes and he fell hard onto the grass. "Sir Thomas!" Roland said in outrage. Thomas turned wide-eyed on Roland. "Did you say something?" "He had surrendered!" Roland protested. "I'm deaf," Thomas said. "I was hit on the head. I can't hear a thing. What are you telling me?" "He had surrendered!" "I can't hear what you're saying," Thomas said. He turned away and winked at Sam. 50 yards away, men were fighting around the King of France. His standard had fallen, the standard bearer was dead, and his son was trying to help his father. "Look left, father! To the right! Watch out!" The king was fighting with an axe, though no one was trying to kill him, just to capture him. The decoys who had worn his colours were dead or had fled, but everyone knew this was the real king because his helmet was surmounted by a golden crown, and men wanted to take him alive because his ransom would be unimaginably huge. Men grabbed at the king, fought each other to get close to him, and the king shouted that he could make them all rich. But then 2 horsemen forced their great destriers into the crowd and bellowed at all the men to step back on pain of death. The Earl of Warwick and Sir Reginald Cobham confronted King Jean and Prince Philippe. Both men dismounted, and both men bowed low. "Your Majesty," the Earl said. "I am a prisoner," the King of France said. "Alas, your Highness," Sir Reginald said. "It is the fate of battle." The king was taken. One of the archers played pipes made from oat straw, the tune wistful and thin. A campfire burned, throwing twisting red light onto the branches of the oaks. A man sang, other men laughed. The King of France was being feasted by the Prince of Wales, while on the flat hilltop where the battle had ended, the birds and beasts gorged themselves on the dead. The dead went all the way to the gates of Poitiers, because the English and Gascons had pursued the enemy that far, and the citizens of Poitiers, fearing an English invasion, had refused to open their gates, and so the fugitives had been trapped under the walls, and there the last of them had died. The old Roman road that ran to the city was littered with the dead, but now the living sat around fires and ate food they had plundered from the enemy's abandoned camp. Thomas had joined the pursuit, riding with Sam and a dozen other archers. Those riders would all become rich on their plunder, but Thomas had not ridden to find jewels or plate armour or an expensive horse. "You found him?" Genevieve asked. She sat beside him, her head on his shoulder, and Hugh leaned against her. "I found them both." "Tell me again," she said, like a child wanting to hear a familiar and comforting story. So Thomas told her how he had caught up with Cardinal Bessières, and how the Cardinal's men-at-arms had tried to protect their master, and how Sam and the archers had beaten them down, and Thomas had confronted Father Marchand, who had loudly declared that he was a priest and not a combatant, and Thomas had used La Malice to disembowel him so that his guts slid out from his robe and spilt onto the saddle and then down to the ground, and Thomas had laughed at him. "That's payment for my wife's eye, you bastard." He had been tempted to let the priest die in agony, but then killed him with another swing of La Malice. Cardinal Bessières had been begging for mercy. "You are a combatant," Thomas said. "No, I am a cardinal, I will pay you." "I see no red hat," Thomas said. "Only a helmet." and the cardinal had tried to pull the bassinet off his head, then screamed as he saw La Malice coming, and the scream only stopped when St. Peter's blade had ripped open his throat. Only then had Thomas turned back towards the battlefield, where the dead now lay beneath the stars. Roland was with his Bertie. "I should have shouted at you," he told Thomas. "I didn't realize you had been deafened." "It was a terrible mistake," Thomas lied gravely, "and I apologize." "It was not dishonorable," Roland said, "because you were not to know he had surrendered. He was still holding a sword, and you were deafened." "It was God's will," Bertie said. She looked radiant. Roland nodded. "It was God's will," he agreed, then, after a pause, "And La Malice?" "She's gone," Thomas said. "Where?" "Where she cannot be found," Thomas said. He had taken La Malice to the largest gap in the hedge, where men were piling weapons discarded on the battlefield. The good weapons were put into one pile, the cheap and worthless weapons onto another. There were broken swords, shattered crossbows, an axe with a bent blade, and a score of rusted falchions. "What happens to them?" Thomas had asked the man wearing the Prince of Wales's three-feathered badge. "Melted down, like as not. That looks like a piece of shit." "It is," Thomas had said, and he had tossed the sword of the fisherman onto the pile of worthless junk. It looked no different to all the other cheap falchions. A shattered spear had landed on top of it, then a broken sword had clattered onto the heap. When he had looked back, Thomas could not even tell which sword was the relic and which was not. It would be put into the fire, melted, and then reforged. Perhaps a ploughshare. "Now we go home," he said. "Castillon first, then back to England." "Home," Genevieve said happily. The sword of St. Peter had come. It had gone. It was over. It was time to go home.